I like surprises. There are a few things better than being caught off guard by something wonderful that you weren't expecting, but realized that you absolutely wanted. Maybe it was something that you thought you needed, maybe it was just an unexpected but welcome intrusion. But then sometimes the surprises are awful, an unasked for and unmitigated interruption of a series of events that are altogether horrendous. Queen Cleopatra is unfortunately and hysterically the latter. In my previous video from a few weeks ago, I focused on debunking the lies that Jada Pinkett Smith and Tina Garabi are so intent on pushing. Today I'll be doing more of that, but simply from a different angle. I'm also going to focus on the writing, acting, and dialogue of this show, because let me tell you, they are almost as painful as the historical inaccuracies. Couple all of this with the showrunners and Adele James's insistence on calling everyone who rightly criticizes the show racist, then you have what is quite possibly the most unpopular and unsophisticated and perhaps hated show of all time. The sheer vitriol this so-called documentary has produced is absolutely astounding, culminating in the entire country of Egypt attempting to sue Netflix over the inaccurate cultural representation in the show. I absolutely endorse this action and hope they succeed in making Netflix pay for the sheer hubris that went into this program. On top of that, the country is also planning their own documentary in response to the Netflix abomination, which is a project that I will endorse and would like to see when it comes out. But in the meantime, while we wait for a true representation of history and not a fever dream that came out of the mind of a liberal arts activist, let's talk about the show. Full warning, I could only get through the first 2 episodes of this flaming garbage before I had to call it quits, but here is what I made of the show so far. Cleopatra was a complex person. She has been a figure of countless studies throughout history. She has been called a scholar, a progressive queen, the last pharaoh of Egypt, as well as a tempter and a seductress. I am quite willing to believe all of these things about her because she was a whole person with realistic flaws and failings, one of which led to her death. Netflix, however, has decided that they are going to focus on 3 things about her life, and 3 things only. The color of her skin, the people that she slept with, and her status as a girl boss in comparison to those around her. Because apparently sex and skin color were the only interesting things about Cleopatra. In addition to including little, if any, historical facts, the historians, spend a lot of time talking about how epic Cleopatra was, how much of a girl boss she was, how her sheer presence overwhelmed the people around her, particularly Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And this is what frustrated me continuously about the 2 episodes that I watched. The activists, the historians, spend almost every second repeating themselves about Cleopatra's greatness. They don't talk about the minute political aspects of her reign, her life as a child, who she really was before Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Instead, they waste their time waxing poetic about how magnificent Cleopatra was, placing her on this pedestal because they are so desperate to fill the 48 minutes of television. The lack of intelligence in this documentary really shines through here, making it both sad and laughable. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping moment of the first 2 episodes is when one of the activists claims that they can imagine Cleopatra however they want, and that he imagines her to have curly hair like he does, along with a similar skin color. This was an utterly appropriate way to define the nonsense that was this show and drive home that no one who put this work of media together has a clue what they are talking about. Very little was included about her work as a scholar or the scientific experiments that she conducted. No one talked about her skill as a politician or negotiator. And don't even get me started on the actual cinematic parts of this documentary, if they can even be called that. In addition to Adele James being an utterly atrocious actress in this series, she spends a lot of time shouting at the camera about who she is and that she is a god. I found that scene in particular interesting because in ancient Egypt, rulers were often likened to the divine. The commoners held the religious belief that their monarchs were deities walking among them. To act against them was a treason and an act of blasphemy. The male rulers were, of course, likened to gods themselves. It is interesting, therefore, that the Cleopatra of this show would liken herself not to a goddess, as her gender would dictate, but instead to a god. She continues to call herself Isis, but Isis was a goddess. I find it fascinating that this show would place so much emphasis on Cleopatra taking on a male characteristic in her rule when the show is supposed to be about African queens. It's almost as if they are claiming that being female isn't enough, and to truly have power, one must become a man. Perhaps that is why femininity is not encouraged in females these days, and this show is simply another bullet point in a long line of feminist social justice shows that are desperate for ultimate power masked as equality. Not only that, but the show claims that there was a time when women ruled with unparalleled power. Obviously, this is not true. Of the time period in which they speak, there was only one woman. This was actually a male-dominated period of history, and so to act as if women were being called to the throne every generation to rule in favor of their male counterparts is a blatant lie. So too is a lie that Julius Caesar wanted to be king to Cleopatra's queen. This makes it seem as if Julius Caesar was a sniveling politician trying to work his way up the rungs of power. He was not Peter Baelish from Game of Thrones. Julius Caesar had a reputation long before he met Cleopatra as a ruthless military commander, a man who helped form one of the greatest empires in history, and who commanded legions of men and politicians to do his bidding. Cleopatra would have been an enticing distraction to him, but Egypt by no means held the reins of power during this time period. In fact, Cleopatra had to beg favors from Caesar in order for her reign to remain secure. So for the show to claim that there is no Rome without Egypt is another blatant lie. The more I watched of this docuseries, the more I began to realize that very little of it was factual, and that the historians that had been hired were simply there to spout the ideals of modern-day women from a pseudo-historical perspective. They are obsessed with the idea of a liberated woman who controls men and who leads them around by the nose. They are obsessed with the idea of power, particularly power that is in a woman's hands. If it is in the hands of a man, it can only be a bad thing. That is why they spent so much time talking about how obsessed Caesar and Antony were with Cleopatra, and how obsessed Cleopatra was with power, because they don't understand any other way to be. It is only right to them that men should be obsessed with a woman who has power, because that is correct. Sex and power were the two greatest themes in this show, because to the showrunners, they are the only things of value that Cleopatra had. And this is one of the greatest indications that the people who wrote this historical fan fiction are irrevocable fools. Continuing with this modern-day feminist manifesto masquerading as a historical documentary, the opening lines of this documentary use lines like, "Few knew the real woman that was Cleopatra." Yes we do. There are texts, murals, archaeologists, and Egyptologists that were and are heavily invested in Cleopatra's life. Why weren't they included in this documentary, I wonder? But perhaps one of the most telling things that sums up the collective lack of intelligence of everyone involved in this project is the fact that they contradict themselves constantly. The series claims that Cleopatra was a woman who did not bow to any man, and yet 5 minutes later, it claims that Cleopatra aligned herself with men who had considerable amounts of power. If we want to look at further contradictory statements, we can look no further than this woman who claims that her grandmother was the premier historian over any Egyptologist, any archivists, or any archaeologist. She also contradicts herself by saying that ancient Egyptians would have had a variety of complexions. Skin color would have ranged from black to pale brown. So first we demand that Cleopatra be black, but then the statement is backtracked by saying that Egyptians of that day were very ethnically diverse. They are trying so hard to cling to their Trojan horse, and it is simply falling apart around them. And then we have this fellow who states that the beauty of Cleopatra is that everyone can imagine her in their own way. Well, no, you can't, because she was an actual historical figure with historical significance who made decisions that were written down in history and studied extensively. This is not a figure that was made up, and this is possibly the most insulting thing about this so-called documentary. The claim that the most wonderful thing about Cleopatra is that we lack evidence that can give us a definitive answer about her appearance, because this way, everyone can have a truth that they liked best about her. Not only is this possibly the highest form of narcissism that I have ever heard, but in the disciplines of history and science, personal truth does not hold a candle to factual truth. And so to rewrite a character in the image of a modern-day activist's viewpoint and call personal truth factual is perhaps the most racist thing that one can do. An entire country's history is being rewritten because of a few people on Netflix decided that they were so prideful that they wanted to rewrite history in their image. I won't talk too much about the dialogue in this show because it really isn't worth mentioning. None of it sounds like what an ancient Egyptian would say. All of it sounds quite modern day, and it really is very, very cringy. Here's another lie. The documentary claims that at the time of Cleopatra's reign, Rome was an emerging power. Incorrect. Rome was a fully formed power at this time. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. Both Punic Wars had been waged and won by Rome before Cleopatra was ever born. So not only have we insulted Greeks and Egyptians with this documentary, we have insulted the Italians as well. Well done, Netflix. You certainly have never done anything by half measures, have you? I could go on, but I really don't want to keep talking about this show anymore because nothing about it and its lies deserves a continued ounce of my brain power. Apparently, this is also the collective opinion of the rest of the sane world as well, for this show has a laughably low rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and I hope that it stays that way. Good luck with your lawsuit, Egypt. I will be watching with interest. And when the documentary that shows factual evidence of Cleopatra is released, rest assured that I will be watching that one as well.